Hello and welcome to Penticton. Today we're going to talk about the 2023 Financial and Corporate Plan, or as most people call it, the budget. Now, if you're like me, reading a budget is a bit of a mind-numbing exercise. So today we're going to try and get behind the numbers. What does it mean to you as a property owner? How will it impact small businesses? As a resident, what do you get for your money? That's going to be today's topic on Penticton. I'm Shane Mills, joined by Joanne Klebb, and our guest today is Angela Campbell, the Director of Finance and Administration for the City of Penticton. So welcome, Angela.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So the good news for Angela is she's used to me asking really basic questions, and I'm always impressed by the kindness of you and your staff to wait till I leave the room before you roll your eyes. So like, how could he not know what that means? It's like,
well, and I'd like to start by coming to the defense of the budget. You know, while you may think it's a mind-numbing exercise, like this is really the place where the plans for the first and next 5 years are set. And so if citizens really want to know what's coming up in their community, this is the time to get involved.
I mock because I'm not very good at maths, but it is the most important thing, right? People talk about the levels of government. Federal government's in Ottawa, provincial government's in Victoria, and we really don't know what they spend their money on. This is where you see your tax dollars in action, and you also get to see the politicians right away to talk about it. So first question everyone always has, Angela, is how much is the increase? How big is it going to whack me?
Okay, so the tax increase is made up of three parts. The first part is an operational inflational increase, and that's made up of 3.4%. So that's covering the cost of the CPI that we're seeing for the year. And staff have really worked hard to keep that number down. BC CPI was 6.9% for 2022, and we've brought it down to 3.4%. So that's the first part of the budget. The second part is what we would call operational enhancements or incremental cost of 3%. So that's adding things into the budget like new RCMP members, firefighters, but also accounting for a bit of the increased costs for services that we're already providing that have gone up incrementally more than inflation, and we want council's consideration on that.
And things like contractual obligations are included in that amount too, is that correct?
That's right. In the 3.4%, in the inflationary,
okay. Yeah.
That's where we're accounting for the contractual cost for labor and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so a lot of things that are outside our control.
100%.
Yeah.
Yep. Contracts, the RCMP inflation, we don't have a say in that. It just gets added right into our costs.
Right.
Okay, so the last piece of that 9.7% is what we're calling a phase-in of the taxation deferral from 2022. So last year during budget deliberations, council made some conscious decisions to add a lot of community safety into the budget. We added RCMP officers, firefighters, and added bylaw hours for, I think, 6 a.m. to 11 p.m., which added 7 bylaw officers into our complement. And that came at a significant cost to the taxpayers, and council decided instead of passing that along right away, that we would put that a little bit into the future and phase it in over 3 years.
So I guess this is where there's a difference in government. So people are used to governments running deficits. We just saw the provincial government introduce a budget that has deficits for the next 3 years. You don't get to do that.
That's correct. So different governments have different rules. So municipalities legislation, we are not allowed to run a deficit. We are required to have a balanced budget. And, you know, in turn, we're also not allowed to borrow for operational needs. We can only borrow for capital. So when we do a budget and we add things into it, we have to increase revenues or decrease something else in order to offset that cost. We can't run a deficit budget like the province can.
Now, to pay for the deferral last year, you dipped into the surplus.
That's correct.
And I think there's probably, in people's minds, are like, well, the city's rich. The city's got lots of reserves. Do it again.
Yes, we have heard that a time or two. So the city does have a lot of reserves, but some of them are restricted. They can only be used for certain purposes. Some of them are capital. Some of them belong to other funds like water and sewer. So there's only certain ones that can be used in the general fund. And we did go over that with council last year during the deliberations. And we showed them which reserves that they would have access to in order to offset a tax decrease or a tax increase. So at the end of the day, we can do that, but only for so much time. It's like having a savings account. You can borrow from it for a while, but at some point the money runs dry and you actually have to either increase your revenues or decrease your expenses. And that's where we're at now. We're going to be drawing from surplus for the next at least 2 or 3 years. to offset this phase-in, but we do need to phase it in.
So the alternative, just so people understand, is they're like, well, just pay off the bill, get it done. Well, that would be then somewhere around like a 17% property tax increase this year?
Yeah, that's correct. We deferred about 10% from 2022 into 2023, so that plus the 3.4 plus the other 3 would bring you to over 16% tax increase for the year.
You probably hear this a lot, but Summerland only has this increase, or Vernon only has this increase. I guess I would think it's probably not fair to compare communities to communities, but I'll let you explain why they shouldn't do that, probably.
Sure. So we do hear that a lot, and we do compare ourselves to other municipalities, but it really isn't apples to apples because different communities have different services, they offer different things, and they also have different levels of threshold for where they're willing to let their infrastructure run down to. So the other thing I would say is that as part of this budget, the 3.4% inflation operational increase, that's well in line with other municipalities, right? You talk about Summerland specifically, their increase I think was 3.76. Our inflationary increase is 3.4. So if we weren't doing the deferral and we weren't looking to continue to enhance our service levels with things like added RCMP, we would be in the same range as those other municipalities.
And I guess that's what people are always like, I pay my taxes, and they're wondering where their taxes go. And here in Penticton for the last couple of years, community safety has really been a lot. Like, we've added a lot of police officers, and they're not cheap. Firefighters are not cheap, right? Like, those are expenses that you have to pay.
I was surprised to see just what the overall cost is for each RCMP officer and firefighter.
So each RCMP officer is about $204,000. Fire can vary depending on what we're hiring, but the addition of 4 firefighters is a cost of $442,000 this year.
Yeah, and it's not just their salary, it's the whole employment
right.
package, yeah.
Yep, that's labor load, full
Right.
benefits, all that.
So because we like to compare ourselves to other communities, we, in contrast, do pretty well in terms of how much you pay in taxes for the services you get, right?
Yeah, I would say so. We're very competitive with the other communities in the Valley. And, going back to community safety, we invest over 40% of our general fund expenses into community safety. So that's RCMP, bylaw, fire. So of the $63 million that are being spent, 40% of that's going just towards community safety.
And I think people get, when Kristen was on Dixon a couple of weeks ago, we talked about this. People just sort of expect the utilities to turn on, right? Like, there's always going to be water. The sewer is going to work when I need it, and there's always going to be electricity. But you have to plan for costs for those, and those are in the budget as well. So can you talk a bit about the utilities and the reserves? And because if I have it right, there's is it $12 million we're planning to spend on utility sort of maintenance renewal?
Yeah, it's just over $12 million for the utilities capital for the year. So the utility funds, that's water, sewer, and electric, they are self-funded. So they're paid for through the user fees, through your electric utility bill, your water, your sewer. And those are self-funded, we call them, because the revenues that we collect for those pay for all the operating expenses and all the capital expenses. So if they turn a surplus, like they have excess revenues over expenses, those all go into reserves to fund future expenses. One of the things we do here is, well, we've got lots of electric surplus money, but the fact of the matter is we haven't been passing along the Fortis costs for many years, and I think now the gap is somewhere around 10% of what they've passed along to us that we haven't passed along to our customers. And at some point, we are going to have to increase electric rates to catch up with that, or the surpluses again, like we talked about with general, they're going to deplete and disappear.
Right. And we started to do that this year. We reduced the rate, but we did increase it a bit, right? The Fortis rates?
Correct. We proposed 4% in line with what Fortis was presenting, and council decided to do a 2% increase instead.
The other thing that caught me in the budget was I'm not good with numbers, as I told you. It's about $15 million for improvements to things like a new fire truck or recovering the soccer bubble. So again, there's all these. So I've been here less than a year in Penticton, and I'm struck by the number of amenities that a city of this size has, but it costs money to keep them up. or because there's money for tennis court repavement, and the SOEC always needs work, and the Cleveland Theater has had work done. So how much does that $50 million count towards the tax increase, or can you make that comparison?
So we actually fund very little of our capital work through taxation. We do it through a lot of other means. So there's the electrical dividend that pays for a good part. We also get a fairly decent amount of gas tax money or community building fund. We use that money to fund our capital. The other thing I think we've done a good job of is we put money aside in reserves for those things. So for example, the fire truck, that's coming out of the equipment replacement reserve. So as we buy assets, we depreciate them, and that money goes into a reserve to pay for its replacement later. So if you look at the financial plan, and I hope all of you do, you'll see on the capital page, there's a wide array of funding that we use to fund our capital assets. That could be DCCs, development cost charges. It could be reserves. It could be, if it's the utilities like we talked about, it'll be funded through the user fees. So we really try hard to fund the assets in whatever way we can that has the least impact on the taxpayer.
So I'm interested. So property taxes, where every year people get on January 1st or January 2nd or whenever BC assessment puts out its numbers, everyone loses their mind because they see how much their house went up in value and they think that's how much their tax bill is going up. But with the budget, you're anticipating per month how much, I guess at the extreme, say council makes no changes and just says fine 9.7, it's about what, $20 a month, somewhere in there?
For taxes, it would be 15 for a resident. If you were to include all the utility fee increases, it would be about $20 per your average house.
Okay. And what would that
$20 per month.
$20 per month.
Right.
Yeah.
And then for the business side, because we've heard a lot from small businesses that they haven't fully recovered, but in terms of the budget, and we're going to get a little bit, and this is really where Joanne will know way more than I do, in terms of the engagement and the deliberation process. But in terms of the business taxes, you set it based on direction that's sort of in the city bylaws, or I'm not sure exactly where they're set, but you have a direction and then council can adjust in terms of business taxes.
That's correct. So the average business right now, we're estimating at the top end would pay $58 per month for the tax increase if it was 9.7. And that is based on the revenue neutral business tax multiplier, which is what council's policy tells us to do. So staff come in and we do that. And basically what the revenue neutral model means is that everybody pays the same. So if taxes go up 6.7%, residents and businesses will both see 6.7% increase on their taxes, assuming that they have the average assessment increase that BC Assessment came out with. So this is where council does have discretion to shift what we call a business tax multiplier. And that changes the burden of taxes between residents and businesses. So we will provide that information to council during deliberations for them to make a preliminary decision, but we won't have final assessment numbers till the end of March. And so we'll revisit it with council when we bring forward the tax rates, and then they can see the final impact to both residents and businesses and make a decision as to where they want to set that business tax multiplier.
So traditionally, is it usually relatively down the line? Because I've lived in communities like, back when I lived there, they were thriving, but like they have like 5 sawmills and 2 pulp mills. So they had no problem sort of diverting most of the funding onto the business side. But here it's probably more evenly balanced, and there's some seasonal businesses.
I would say, the majority of our, we call them folios, or our properties, are actually residential. So if you look at the burden of taxes between residential and commercial, it's usually somewhere between 75-25 between resident and business. But that shifts depending on what happens with assessed values. So we see that change every year, and that's also information we give to council when they want to make their decision as to who's going to bear the burden of the tax increases. And
so I guess one of the things that will come, and you don't make these decisions. Council gets to make these decisions. And I guess that's important for people to know. This is the proposed budget. This isn't like, say, the provincial budget or a federal budget where it's dropped and here you go, hope you like it. You've said this is our best estimates. These are your choices. where I was going with this was, though, people are like, there's trade-offs, and they're like, I don't want to pay more taxes. Well, do you want our parks not to be as clean? And how do you, and I guess it's not just you get all that feedback from the different departments, but it's, how do you balance those choices before it even gets to council? Because you're making choices when you're setting the budget.
So it's a really good question. The budget process generally takes somewhere around 6 to 8 months for us. We start pretty early on doing capital and fees and charges before we get into operating. Every department submits a budget to their supervisor, and it's vetted. And then it's vetted through the budget, our financial planning and budget specialist. And then it's reviewed by staff. And then it's reviewed by senior staff. And at all of those levels, we're looking at what are the increases, what's going on with each individual department. Generally speaking, we would start most of our budgets with the base budget, the same operating level that we had the year before, unless council's given us some other direction prior to budget. That's our starting point. If there's increases that someone is suggesting, especially with a service level, that gets council's decision. If there's new FTE requests, new employees that have budget impact, that goes to council. So all of those are council's decisions. During deliberations, they can still decide that they want to change service levels, either up or down. That's their job, is to, when we present the budget, to decide what they want to see. And they tell staff, and we will come back with the revisions.
So
I think that leads to a really great question as well. A lot of times what we hear is that, residents think, is this just a wish list of staff? Where do we get the ideas for the initiatives and that end up in the budget?
So a lot of our initiatives are guided by council strategic priorities, right? Council decides what direction they want the city to give and take, and staff try to align our initiatives with what will advance council's priorities. So that's usually our starting point. Not to say there aren't operational things that departments need to either provide better service, for example, right? Maybe we want to do online permitting. So we would go and say, okay, well, let's get a system, let's put that in place. Those would be operational requests that council usually sees as well, depending on the dollar value of them.
Yeah, and I would jump in there. Just kind of near and dear to my heart is all the work we do to create these long-term plans, and things like the Community Climate Action Plan, the Skaha Park East Master Plan, the Official Community Plan, all of these different plans that we've been working on over the years. This is where they start getting actioned, is the department that owns the plan goes through the plan and looks for the different initiatives and recommendations in there, and then plans them and times them to be included in the budget. So there's some exciting things that are coming up that people may not be aware of. Things like with the Skaha Park Master Plan, they'll be replacing the Splash Park this year. That's in the budget. So that all comes from that pre-planning work that the community has the opportunity to get involved in.
Yeah, because I found it interesting when you were just talking about that. So like the 3.4 that we talked about, that one increase, that's how much it will cost people to keep the flower baskets on Main that we all love, right? That's how much it costs to keep the beaches clean, which drives our sectors during the summer. We want people to come here for all of our festivals. Our parks need to be clean, pristine.
Yeah.
And those are the basic costs. So
yeah, those are our service levels that we need to maintain.
And so, do you want those to go down?
Yeah.
No one's going to say.
Well, we're going to find out. We're going to ask them, actually.
That's a good point. There's more I want to talk specifically to Angela about the budget. There's one thing which we can wait what it is, probably. But what we were talking about, this isn't the final budget. So, Joanne, do you want to sort of take people through some of how they can have their say?
When it comes time to rolling it out to the community, it's the proposed budget, there's yet a further opportunity for residents to get involved. We have an online information session coming up on March 6th that you can register at Shape Your City, and we also have an open house. Actually, it's our first council-hosted open house planned for March 9th. It'll be at the Penticton Trade Convention Center from 4 to 7 p.m. And so council will be there to hear your questions and discuss your concerns with you. But we'll also also have staff there presenting the budget or sharing the budget. We'll have representatives from Protective Services there. So this is actually, it's quite exciting. There's an opportunity for people to talk to Superintendent Hunter and to Chief Larry Watkinson and to our bylaw services manager, Tina Mercier. And these are conversations that people have wanted to have. So we're providing this opportunity for people to meet in person and talk to staff and council.
And to get a bit more of the detail of what's in there.
That's right.
And so the community safety stuff is, sorry, Angela, if a budget can be sexy, the community safety stuff is the sexy part of the budget. That's what everyone's like, yeah, good, right?
That's what they've been asking for, yep.
That's what we need. But one of the things that you mentioned, which isn't probably nearly as interesting to most people, they're like, why do we need to do that? Was sort of, we need to improve our infrastructure as a city in terms of like online permitting, right? Like everyone wants online permitting, right? Everyone's like, well, why can't I do it online? Well, because we have to create our systems, and that's not free. And so those type of projects we need to do, and sometimes
like the GIS mapping too.
GIS mapping, right? Or upgrading, the billing system for the utilities, right? All those type of things come with costs, and you have to find out how to balance them and when to put them in so you can continue those improvements and provide the service they want. Because ICBC is just finally getting around to it, and now everyone likes them again because they can renew things online, and that's what people want to be able to do.
Yeah,
and
they
I know
want that
there's
convenience.
I'm not sure how much of it's in this budget, but I know the building folks are pretty excited about some of the stuff they're doing on online permitting.
Yeah, that's right. So that system is actually pretty well done. I think almost, I'm not sure if it's quite launched yet or it's close to being launched, but other exciting things we're looking at, I think are exciting, are, expanding our payment options. That's built inside of here, right? That's one of our initiatives too. It's not a huge cost to the taxpayers.
Allow people to pay with the credit card?
It would allow people to pay with a credit card at City Hall, which is something we've heard for a really long time. So, there are exciting initiatives like that are built in here that take staff time, maybe more so than money, but they're important for council to know where we're spending our resources too. Because it isn't just about adding money to the budget, it's how is staff spending their time, and is that time being spent doing things council would like us to be working on.
Yeah. So the one thing I have to ask about, because you're going to hear it, bike lanes. Because it always comes up. In this budget, what I'm asking, are people's taxes going up to pay for the final phase?
So the final phase of the bike lane is built into the budget. It's being funded by DCC money, by gas tax money, and the last portion is a grant we're awaiting to hear back on. If we're not successful in that grant, then we'll revisit how the funding will be made. But there is no taxpayer money being spent on that final phase of the bike lane. But council did approve finishing this bike lane through their notice of motion process, so it is in here. For anybody that goes through this line by line, they'll see that there's a bunch of unfunded projects also included in here, which has further sections of, I think, feeder networks for the bike lane that council can decide in the future if they want us to look at how we would fund.
Right.
Yeah, so people shouldn't necessarily be scared by what they see in there. This is all just us supporting an informed decision-making process by letting council and the community know what different projects are potentially on the horizon, but decisions haven't necessarily been made on them yet.
Exactly. There's a lot of prioritizing and deferring that goes into the budget process, not just on the operating side, a lot on the capital side, because there's only so much money that we can expend, and there's only so many resources to do those projects year over year. So there's a lot of time and energy spent figuring out what projects will be done in what year, what's priority, what would the public like to see, what does council want to see when we determine what the projects go forward.
And one of the big ones, though the dollar figure is not very big in the budget yet because that's not determined, is the community safety building.
That's right.
Because there's money in there to make sure that we're advancing that along.
That's right. The planning phase is built into the budget. The actual building itself is still sitting as unfunded until council gives further direction on what they want to see and if they want to proceed with the project. Then we'd get final costs and figure out options for how it could be funded. And those will all be brought back to council for their decision.
And shared publicly.
Yes.
Of course.
So budget's a bit later than normal this year because of the election. Other municipalities did it differently. They were just like, hi, new council. Here's your budget, please approve it. You took a different approach. giving the new council time to, understand the budget, have some input,
Think about their priorities.
get to their council priorities. Is that some of that is reflected in this budget and will be more reflected, I guess, going forward? Because you mentioned council's priorities.
Yeah, I think going into the budget, we had heard from council already community safety. It was on a lot of their platforms. We'd heard them speak about it already at council meetings. So there were certainly progressing with community safety was built into this budget already. As to their other priorities, yeah, we didn't know what they were going to be. They just got endorsed at the last council meeting. We will see a further reflection of that for sure in the 2024 budget.
Yeah, and people need to understand that while we're going through this major exercise now, that we'll be doing this again in just a few months.
That's right. We'll be kicking off the next budget probably 1 or 2 months after this one's finished. Not that the public will see, but staff will start working on compiling the budget probably in June.
And that's just simply to get us back on our preferred schedule.
That's right. We'll be coming back for deliberations in November again this year, which is our normal budget cycle. And I will say there's some benefits to going later. Not that I'm suggesting we do that on a regular basis, but we actually have 2023 assessed values for this budget, which